Larry, thanks very much for doing this.
Thanks, Jeff.
You know, you have a great advantage of, because of what BlackRock is, you meet some of the smartest people in the world, both your clients, people who invest money, but also government officials and leaders of financial firms. So I would like to really start with asking you about some views that you have basically based on a lot of these discussions and based on your own experience. And I'd like to start really with how you are thinking about the overall response to the financial crisis. If we take the last 5 years, let's say the 5 years since Lehman, what do you think are the hallmarks of this response, this global response? And on balance, do you think it has been proportional to the depth of the crisis, or there's a lot more to do?
That's a pretty complex, long question. So
yeah. you can answer it with a few observations.
Let me try to frame it out. Probably the biggest change from the Lehman crisis has been society's recognition that banks possess too much risk. And so much of the risk within the banking system and the securities system was very opaque. And there was a need for society to be more protected. I think there was a belief that capitalism can self-police.
Right.
And that certainly were the Federal Reserve's policies under Chairman Greenspan. And even Chairman Greenspan now admits that's probably wrong, that capitalism at its extreme probably has to have some type of curbs of the road. And whether the curbs of the road are too narrow or too wide yet, we'll know over the next 10-year process. But where we are 5 years from the time of the crisis is, I think we have a much safer system in terms of leverage in the system. We have moved so much of our security markets onto exchanges, and that process will continue. So we'll have a less opaque market. We are demanding higher capital standards for the banking system or all leveraged institutions. And now we are imposing leverage ratios. And so it's very clear for me to say that we should probably not expect to see another banking crisis like we've seen in the past as these rules are implemented. That doesn't mean we're not going to have another crisis. What I'm fearful going forward is, as we navigate more and more of the businesses onto exchanges, and we're already seeing glitches. There was one, I think, the last few days on the NASDAQ where you have these temporary glitches. So the big fundamental problem is, as we move more and more products onto exchanges, and we're only beginning to move the bond market onto exchanges. I mean, equity markets still have many glitches per month, and yet this is a market that's been trading on exchanges throughout our lifetimes. But the bond market is much more complex, and as we move that market onto exchanges, we're putting all this business onto entities that are public-private. Well, that's what Fannie and Freddie was. They were public-private entities. And so I'm raising the question now, as we move and navigate all this business onto exchanges, should we not start making sure that there's a greater systematic review, that these enterprises are investing sufficiently in technology, sufficiently in the entire enterprise to assure society that they deserve this change in policy and through that policy directing all this business onto these exchanges. And so to me, we are now telling these exchanges they have a higher responsibility. Right. And we need to make sure that, so for instance, should they be considered systemically important institutions going forward? There's no conversation of that yet. And so I would say overall we have a safer system. We're evolving how the world, how the system will look. And we'll see how this all plays out. It's funny, we're at our 10-year anniversary with Sarbanes-Oxley. And if you go back then, We always used to. If you read the narrative right after the announcement and the implementation of Sarbanes-Oxley, we said it's going to kill the capital markets in the United States. We have higher standards in the world. People will be listing elsewhere. It is so costly that you're not going to see small companies list anymore. Indeed, in the first few years of Sarbanes-Oxley, there was an arbitrage. Companies listed in other exchanges. We saw, we had many complaints about the cost of implementation of Sarbanes-Oxley. 10 years down the road, you never hear about the cost of implementation of Sarbanes-Oxley because we routinized it, we put it on technology, we all understand it. And then more importantly, as we witnessed some frauds in other exchanges over the last few years, people are saying, no, I'm much more comfortable investing in the United States. And on top of that, you have the Facebooks and the Twitters coming to market now. So you have the small enterprises coming to market now using our exchanges. And there's even a debate for companies about Alibaba, should they be listing in the United States versus a Chinese exchange. So I think a 10-year horizon is a better time to really reflect on it. And I would say today, most people would say Sarbanes-Oxley is a very successful rule and regulation, whereas a year after we were all questioning it. And I think another 5 years out, we're going to say a good part of Dodd-Frank, a good part of Basel III, have some great merits to society, but that doesn't mean we're perfect. That doesn't mean we're not going to have to make some amendments, and that doesn't mean we're not going to have other crises in the future.
That's great, and that's a great time frame, this 10-year time frame. So using the same one, let me ask you a different kind of question. When you think about the global financial system, in all the dimensions that you just implied, the size of the markets, their ability to move, to innovate, the sizable regulatory pressures that exist. If you had to put your finger on 2 or 3 of the biggest sort of macro trends that are going to drive markets and regulators over the next decade, I'm thinking that the global financial system will be buffeted and it will move in large part because of underlying economic and political trends. You talk to people about this all the time. What are some of the really mega trends that you think are going to drive the whole system?
So one of the great mega trends that I see is as we shrink balance sheets of banks, activity has to go elsewhere. Once again, we said some of the activity is going to go to exchanges, but implicitly what I'm saying is we're going to move more and more of commerce onto the capital markets. The United States is benefiting by we have the most robust capital market. So it's not going to have a big implication in the United States because the bond market is large, trades very freely. Right now we're going through this digestion of bid-ask spread because as Wall Street's balance sheets are shrinking and they can't use their balance sheets anymore, the bid-ask spread's wider, and as we navigate more of that onto exchanges, I think you'll see the bid-ask spread narrow. But on a global perspective, let's talk about China or Asia for a second. They have very small and weak capital markets. If you believe global banks, global institutions are going to have to conform to these standards of capital standards and leverage ratios, then every country in the world is going to have to develop more robust capital markets. And I believe this will become one of the giant macro trend for financial services industry and for all corporations to finance. They're not going to go to a bank as often anymore. They're going to go and issue debt onto the markets or issue equity onto the markets. And once we have exchanges, by the way, the question is, do they even need to go to a bank anymore? Can they go directly onto an exchange and have the capital centers buy and sell that? And it's almost going back to the future. So, Jeff, when you and I were infants in the industry, I remember when the insurance companies controlled the whole corporate bond market because most corporations raise debt in a private placement facility through directly to insurance companies. They did not go to a bank or a security firm. They went directly to an insurance company. if these exchanges that are developed and the capital markets are developed globally, you're going to see a greater process in which these companies will issue onto an exchange, and I think there will be some type of electronic process through the SEC and other global regulators, and maybe there is a global regulator on issuance of bonds or stocks. But the key notion will be more things will trade through capital markets onto exchanges. And it's going to be a better free trade between capital and those who need capital.
A more efficient market and a more fluid one. Right?
More fluid, more transparent. A more fluid, more transparent market doesn't mean it's a less volatile market. The volatility is a function of the trends in one day, and that's where people get, I think people try to elevate this to call it a more liquid market. There are times there can be great liquidity and times there may not be great liquidity. But the key is the role of capital sourcing is probably going to change for the large companies in the future. The question is, can we have a capital markets that allow access for small and medium companies, or or is that the role of banks in the future, that the banks are going to be the prime sources of capital formation for small and medium companies, and the large companies will go in the global capital markets? We'll see. We'll know in 5 more years how that all plays out. But it's very clear. Each country finance minister I speak to, they want to talk about their capital markets and how do they build it. Because I think it's very clear for Brazil, who has great needs for capital as they build out their infrastructure. For Southeast Asia, that has great needs for infrastructure, they're going to need to build out their capital markets. And that's going to be the big macro trend that I see that's going to be evolving from this regulatory change that we witnessed by shrinking balance sheets of banks. It's going to have to move elsewhere.
So let's turn to the asset management industry itself. How do you see it evolving in this world where there's more emphasis on safety, where you have, as you just said, more exchanges, more vibrant capital markets everywhere? I think implied in what you were saying is massive investment needs and things like infrastructure. There's obviously a trend towards a growing middle class around the world, a huge number of people who will have disposable income.
And need to save for their retirement.
So talk about your industry and how it may evolve, how it may look different 10 years from now than it does today.
Well, there's a debate going on even in the United States. What is an asset manager? We have been recently asked to comment on the Financial Stability Board's request on should asset managers be systemically important institutions. And so the role of an asset manager, we're an agent. So we have to start off, what is an asset manager? We're an agent. It's not our capital. We have probably at BlackRock alone, probably 1,000 different forms of mandates, different styles of investing, different asset classes. So we certainly don't have that herding that everybody's going one way all the time and another way the other way. As long as an asset manager remains to be a fiduciary, as long as the asset management business continues to be guided by outcomes, a retiree, a liability of an insurance company, a liability of a pension fund, if you are guided by outcome and that's what your objective is, I think the asset management business is going to continue to grow. And the asset management business is going to be the source of capital as global capital markets grow. As banks' balance sheets shrink, and as Solvency II is implemented for insurance companies, which means they have shorter duration in terms of their maturity risk in their balance sheets, the greatest source of capital is going to be coming from the asset management, who is entrusted with large pools of pension fund assets. And so I think the asset management business worldwide is going to grow in importance in terms as a capital provider. But the capital provider is going to be a function of what our clients want and what type of mandate we get. But also, if I think back to BlackRock, even 5 years ago, we were never that active in terms of the public debate of public policy related to capital markets, about the public debate about retirement, the public debate about how the financial market should evolve. And yet today we're heavily mixed in that debate. I believe it, as the largest asset management company, we have a responsibility now to be part of that debate. So we've taken it upon ourselves to be in the thick of all this debate, sometimes for good purpose, sometimes less good purpose. But I think one of our key elements that we're trying to educate is this whole concept of longevity. The world's living longer. This is, as you said, we're having a rising middle class. We have not only rising middle class, we have rising life expectancy worldwide. And so this whole idea related to retirement at 60 or 62 or 65, the reality is if you're in your 20s now, you're going to live to about 90, 92 now. That's what the life expectancy of young people today. And the whole notion of how to invest for retirement has to be reconsidered today. Because are you going to really retire at 62 when you have a possibility of living to 92 and have a 30-year life left? That's not so productive, walking away from a 30-year life and living in retirement. So the key is our responsibility is to have these type of debates and conversations. But as a part of that debate and conversation, and we've been very noisy about it, is should you be in bonds that have short maturities when your liability is actually longer? Getting back to outcome investing. And so one of our big pitches worldwide is you're having growing longevity. To think that your liability is only here, your liability is much longer now because of longevity. How are you going to be able to match those needs with appropriate assets? Another reason why I keep on fighting, I guess, the media cycle, because the media cycle makes money on velocity of noise. They have more viewership when there's negative noise. They have very poor viewership when there's positive news. And so they perpetuate negativity, and that negativity freezes that individual, that person, and they actually invest it to a shorter maturity than their needs.
Because they're more nervous.
And they're more nervous, which is natural, but the problem is, does it really matter about the noise today if your liability is 30 or 40 years? It has very little bearing on that outcome. And those are the things that we need to talk about, and this is where I think our governments worldwide are not protecting our citizenship as well as we should be. There has to be a lot more noise, even from academics, about talking about outcomes, and that the reality of this noise of the moment is really is not really a major component of that outcome. And so one of the responsibilities of asset managers is to start talking about outcomes and talking about long-termism and talking about the need to focus on that 30 or 40-year outcome. How much money do you think you need? How are we going to be able to attain it? What do you need to put away today? And the longer we delay that discussion, so that 20-year-old is now 30 or 35 and have not begun putting money away for that outcome, the problem is they have to then, if they want to get to that specific pool of money, they're going to have to put away more of their disposable income, which I'm sure that it becomes even more improbable. So what that has led us now, in the United States, the average American has only $12,000 of savings beyond Social Security. And so this gets back now to public policy in the United States, and I can talk about the world, but when we created Social Security in the 30s, it was never meant to be this 80% of your source of income at retirement. It was meant to be an insurance protection. It's actually a rather poor investment. You have to actually live to about 85 to get a zero return.
Right.
But I mean, it has some great protection. It truly is an insurance policy. It has transferable rights to your spouse or your partner. So there are many good things about it. But it was never meant to be an investment vehicle, and that's one of the real issues. And this is one of the things that we've discussed talking about it as an asset manager, and this is a global thing. We watch what's going on in Australia, where it's mandatory, whether it's you work part-time or full-time, that 9% of your is withheld. So a company provides a 9% payment to the system. It's an investment vehicle, not a. And this is why savings rates in Australia are so large. And if we don't, so what our role is now, not just a U.S. role, but to talk to every country related to how they could best prepare their citizenship for retirement. And depending on the country, the conversation is very different. In Australia, I don't even have to have a conversation because the system is so secure. In the United States, we have some deep discussions. In Europe, we have to have some very deep discussions. The problem that also is why this becomes larger and larger, Jeff, most Americans don't have DB anymore. They have a defined contribution plan. And the problem with defined contribution plans, you as an individual can make your own investment decisions. Getting back to my media cycle and the fear-mongering of media, okay, I'm frightened of that, I'll pull out. And so right now we're witnessing it at the BlackRock Institute, 20% of somebody's 401k or DC plan is in cash. Why would you have cash for 30 or 40-year outcomes? Another large component of a defined contribution plan is in bonds maturing in less than 10 years. Why on earth would you have a bond that matures in 10 years or less when you have that type of outcome? So I'm just trying to suggest, this is a long-winded answer. I think the responsibility of asset managers is growing as our role in the financial community grows, and as an industry, we just need to make sure that we remain an industry that focuses on outcomes, not on the moment.
So let's stipulate that the asset management industry is more and more central to the global financial system. But to hear you talk, it's really more than finance. Really, yeah. It's also the social.
Mm-hmm. Retirement should be a social issue.
Right, it's a social issue as well. So you're right at the center. I'm going to ask you two kinds of questions, one about the industry itself and one about the public policy framework. But in terms of the industry, given that so much of the world lives outside the U.S., mm-hmm. How would you think that the structure would evolve? Will there be other BlackRocks coming from other countries? In other words, do you see more of a globalization in terms of the asset management industry? I know you're very global, but I'm thinking about firms arising elsewhere and able to marshal.
Well, the areas where you're going to have most probably some very large-scale firms would be in the areas that are very populated, like Brazil, India, and China. We have a large pool of population. And you're seeing, asset managers grow in all three places. In China, but let me step back for that. But the growth of those asset management companies in those countries is really dependent on the growth of their capital markets. And if you begin seeing an expansion of the capital market, you see a liberalization, like in China. There's, we'll see in the next few weeks with the plenary what the type of liberalization will occur in China. But if they liberalize parts of the capital markets, then you would see, as a net result, the growth of the asset management industry. In Brazil, the asset management business has been somewhat inhibited because the banks are so large there. It's almost like an oligopoly that control most of finances in Brazil. But also, we've witnessed in Brazil is very high interest rates for so long that it's almost like what the United States was like in the early 80s when we had high interest rates in our country, and most people just invested in overnight money because overnight money was 10%. Well, that's where it is in Brazil. So. But unquestionably, we are going to have new entrances in the asset management business, specifically in the mutual fund business of some sort of the ETF business of those three large countries. And hopefully BlackRock and other asset managers will have an opportunity to be large in those countries too. But right now, BlackRock in China, we're inhibited to have a real venture in China other than a small partnership. In India, it's actually an open economy, but we see most savings remain in banking system because it's an underdeveloped capital markets.
Okay, so let's go back to the central role that asset managers are playing. How might the public policy framework change? We already have a lot of regulation in the U.S. around things like mutual funds, but from a more macro standpoint, is it possible that the more important you become, the more central you are to these populations that are living longer and growing middle class, the more you are a source of capital for long-term investments, infrastructure, that kind of thing, the more attention you get.
No question.
So I'm just wondering, from your standpoint, what is your hope? What would be your ideal evolution of a public policy framework? Because I know that you are not viscerally anti-regulation, and you're not, you don't want to see over-regulation. So what might this framework, what might be some of the changes that occur over the next 10 years in terms of the way you interact with governments?
Well, first of all, we are heavily regulated at BlackRock today. We're one of the few asset managers that is presently regulated by the SEC, by the Federal Reserve, the OCC, FCA in the UK, and so we have tremendous oversight at the moment right now. What we are suggesting as regulators look at our business, there are some businesses that asset managers do that may represent some societal risk. And the first and foremost, which we believe had societal risk, was the money market fund industry. And so we have been very supportive with the SEC to come up with some new regulatory changes on that. Hopefully we will see those roll out between now and year end, in which we're going to have a floating NAV, so the net asset value will be floating, and that will reduce much of the systemic risk. The industry has evolved dramatically already. We shorten up the maturities. The industry has changed its entire structure of how they manage the day-to-day money market funds. But if we now eliminate on the non-government funds the stable value NAV, that will reduce that systemic risk, and the buyers will be aware that there's a possibility of that NAV floating. Right now, we are required on a daily basis to publicize what that NAV is every day. So there's already great movement towards that, and we just haven't officially mandated that. But one of the things that we suggested as governments think about how to look at asset managers, if you look at the two greatest calamities that asset managers have created over the last 15 years, they weren't done by the giant asset managers. They were, and the two names are Reserve Fund, which was a money market fund, which was one of the smallest in the industry, by the way, and Long-Term Capital in 1998. It was a $100 billion leveraged entity. That would not be captured with the definition of scale. And so what we're suggesting as we think about this in our conversations with regulators worldwide, should the focus be on products and a much more severe review of products? Now, should there be some type of capital surcharge on anything that's leveraged, just like a bank? Should there be, I'm just suggesting that, should there be even much greater disclosure and things like that? So as the largest asset manager in the world, we want to make sure that everything's safe. So this is why we have taken a very constructive approach working with regulators, making sure they understand all the issues around what we do and what we don't do. And as we said, we are suggesting that they look at things that present some type of systemic risk. And clearly, leveraged products could do that. If you go back to the original breakdown, how the financial crisis began, I think most people forget it. It happened in 2007. It happened in May 2007. And it was a leveraged mortgage fund that Bear Stearns Asset Management ran. It wasn't Bear Stearns Inc. It was an asset management company of Bear Stearns. And it was a leveraged mortgage mortgage mutual fund or a separate account. So once again, obviously it was a bad product, but the real problem was it was not leveraged. It would not have blown up. It was the leverage that created it. And then the next few months later, you had BNP Paribas walking away from one of their leveraged products, and then you had the freeze of liquidity in Europe in August 2007. But once again, the pernicious problems of asset manager generally has related to leverage or false guarantees in the name of reserve fund. So the SEC is going to address the money market fund business, and in my history, the problems in the asset management business has generally been in the form of leverage. The traditional products have not caused any big issues. Now, there is a roaring debate, and some of the debate has to do with jealousy over what is the role of ETFs. So the question is, are ETFs, they provide, can you see times where ETFs creates more volatility or not? And we have, since we are the largest ETF provider, we could show evidence that especially in the most recent market correction from May 22nd, after the Federal Reserve talked about tapering, which obviously they didn't do, and we saw, a major setback in capital markets worldwide. And there was a day in emerging market equities where we had $5 billion of sell orders, and if we didn't have an ETF, those $5 billion would have sold all the stocks. We had $5 billion of buy orders simultaneously matched, and none of the underlying stock had had the pressure. And so we can show people that instances where ETFs provide stability, not velocity, one way or the other. And so we are willing to have an open dialogue. We, in our position, believe that we have more to lose with a problem, and this is why we have been engaging with regulators worldwide on these issues. Now, I must say there are some people who just have a belief, one way or another, that, okay, if you have $4 trillion, therefore you have to be horrible and bad. And there are many people who believe that. And it takes a lot of time and education. And there are going to be times when I could talk for hours to that individual, and they're not going to change their opinion. So that's life in our business.
I get it.
But the reality is there is going to be more scrutiny in our business, and I don't think it's inappropriate.
One of the things that has propelled this firm is its exquisite skills in risk management. One of the things coming out of the financial crisis, as far as I can tell, is a focus by the public authorities on looking at systemic risk. Mm-hmm. That is, before they looked very much at risk of individual institutions, mm-hmm. but now the big mantra is looking at the system, seeing where there could be a system failure.
Sure.
So, given all the skills that you have mm-hmm. in this firm, what is your sense about the ability of public authorities or anybody to actually monitor global risk as opposed to risks of individual institutions? I mean, a lot of weight is being put on the ability to monitor systemic risk, to think about it, to monitor it, to respond to it. If you look at the Financial Stability mm-hmm. Board or the FSOC, mm-hmm. I just wonder how you think about it in terms of the human capacity and then the capacity of these public authorities.
Well, I mean, you could go back to the balance sheets of these institutions. They were fully regulated at the time, and obviously the regulators did not understand the risk. So it was very clear. One of the fundamental problems was the regulators who were presumably monitoring the risk of these companies alongside with the management team, and clearly that didn't happen. So that's one of the big outcomes that we all have to be honest on for the financial crisis. The question that you're asking, are the regulators, do they have the right technology to manage, to see as a regulator the risk associated with these institutions? These institutions have spent billions and billions of dollars of elevating their risk systems. No, I would say very clearly the risk systems are fundamentally much stronger than they ever were. Regulators, I would presume today, have the ability to aggregate all that risk and look at it in an aggregated basis. I would hope they have that. Just like one would have hoped we have a good technology for our healthcare system as we speak. But one would hope that the Federal Reserve, as a prime regulator in the United States, has the ability to aggregate the risk, so they could see it in a societal way. And that's why, as I said earlier, so the regulators are putting much tighter constraints on leverage and capital, so there is much more protection if they don't see as much, or the management of the institution is not as aware of the risk embedded in their balance sheets.
But here's what I'm reading between the lines. Tell me if I've got it right. What I hear you saying is that there's a very good chance that when it comes to individual institutions, both the institutions and the regulators are better positioned to understand their risk. When it comes to the system as a whole, you hope that we're in better shape, but deep down, you're not sure.
Well, I remember looking at a chart in 2007, and I could go back in my speeches where I said we were in a bubble, but I don't know. But the problem with bubbles, you don't know when it's going to burst, and it might burst in 10 years, or it might burst the next day. But there was one table that showed leverage in the system that was 10 times greater than the leverage that was in the system during long-term capital. That was a Federal Reserve statistic. Right. So that number was there. It was, so you just saw the statistic in the Federal Reserve's data. So one presumably will know that. And now as more and more products trade on exchanges, our regulators are going to be able to see with much greater transparency and clarity what's happening by product as more and more product trades on exchanges, especially derivatives. And at the advent of ETFs now, even for bonds, more and more ETFs are traded on bonds, but trade on exchanges, so they can already see that. So we have more information, more free information than we've ever had to assess the type of risk in the systems. Does that mean we have the right alarms to assess that risk at any one moment to trigger some type of moratorium on risk-taking? I can't tell you. But the one thing I thought you were going towards, one of the issues that people, when they talk about BlackRock or talk about Reuters or Bloomberg, there are a few systems where a lot of people are dependent on. FSOC doesn't, they define what a financial institution is, and BlackRock's asset management side is a financial institution. Our risk management isn't. Bloomberg's not a financial institution. Reuters not. But if you think about the world's dependencies on a Bloomberg system or the dependencies on a Reuters system, it's pretty large. And some people come to BlackRock and say, "Oh, BlackRock should be looked upon because we have BlackRock Solutions, where we have trillions and trillions of client money on our technology system that they use so they use our models to make an assessment."
That's a really good point. Okay, I'd love to spend all day with you. I'm gonna end with, it's kind of a little quiz, and the quiz is, I'm just going to mention some things. Give me a very short answer. You agree or you don't agree. So let's start with the world of currencies and the Chinese currency, the RMB. Mm-hmm. Within 10 years, you think it'll be a reserve currency?
No.
Okay. Let's talk about the configuration of global financial institutions. Do you see more concentration when all is said and done, or are we likely to have a more disaggregated competitive system?
Much greater the latter. And I think you're going to see that accelerate next year.
There's a lot of a discussion, and you're much closer to this than I am, about whether or not financial globalization is going to slow as each country, as the regulators of each country tighten up on sort of the safety. The idea that the Fed is...
That's a long answer, though.
Yeah. So my question is, do you think that this is an anti-global trend with any significance, or does it just make the system...
There's an incredible schizophrenia going on. So, in one sense, regulators want to protect their own shores, okay. And you're seeing that more and more. Even in this country, you have Governor Tarullo talking about demanding the foreign banks with their balance sheets here have capital residing here. More and more countries are talking that way. Regulators are not looking at holding companies anymore. They're looking at the entities, the subsidiary entities by country. one could argue that is an inhibitor of globalization. One could say that that's an inhibitor towards the model of holding companies and having, subsidiaries throughout the world. So in one sense, that is one tension that is reducing globalization. But the other side is, getting back to one of our first questions, every leader I talk to is right now struggling with the need of creating jobs, because technology right now is gutting jobs, even in India, even in China. Everyone thinks it's just a developed world phenomenon. It's a global phenomenon. Every country talks about they need capital for infrastructure. And so I would say that this trend that I'm talking about will overwhelm the trend of having safety and protection with the banking system. I think the growth of the capital markets and the need for the Malaysias and the Brazils and the Chinas to build a more robust capital market for a free exchange of capital is going to push towards much greater globalization.
Thank you very much. That was great.
Thanks.